We're going to talk a little bit about one of Kashina's articles that she wrote called The Power of Loss, Learning to Grieve. Kashina, I loved getting to read this article as someone who has walked through, grief and reading just about your experience, your transparency, and just what you say, as a counselor to people walking through that. And so I would just love if we could start by talking about who this article's written to and what kind of inspired you writing it.
Yeah, if I could just say, to who this article is written to speak to that, in my head, I just kind of picture saying everybody and then just kind of doing like a mic drop and walking away, because that would be so accurate, right?
Yeah.
We've all walked through loss. We've all grieved over a loss in our lives, and some people grieve over a loss that's really, really obvious, where we lose someone we love, or a pet, or just a relationship that has been lost due to divorce or distance. But then there are those that are struggling with a loss of just the idea of the way things should have been, and that's challenging, because you have these ideas of the way you would have liked your finances to go, or you would have liked your marriage to be, or the way you would have just liked your parents to have been different.
And I feel like that kind of loss is sort of under the table. I feel like there's a lot of shame attached to that kind of loss, because it's not obvious, and because it does, from the outside maybe look or seem to be small, or insignificant compared to losing a loved one or something like that. And so I feel like with that kind of loss, there's so much shame and loneliness attached to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's so much shame and loneliness, and it just feels foreign. It's really hard to to really wrap your mind around the pain that you're experiencing there. And so, so that is a huge part of, why I wrote this article, because that loss is, it really has an impact on you and those around you. And so, even though those are losses that we experience, in the article, I really wanted to address those people that have just initially found out, or maybe just discovered that there is a loss in their life, that the life that they had wanted, or the life that they've had, will be different because of this loss. And so, just helping them navigate what is happening to them. And in this case, just put themselves aside and make sense of the trauma, and just normalize some of those really difficult feelings that they're experiencing.
Yeah, Kashina, would you mind just sharing? I know part of the heart behind writing this article is your personal experience. Would you mind just being vulnerable and sharing with us kind of what happened and the heart behind this and what you experienced?
Absolutely. Yeah. So one of the reasons I was really inspired to write this article was because during this time that I was writing this, our family had been impacted by the loss of a close family member. My husband had lost his father, and it was a traumatic event that we didn't expect. We couldn't have planned for what we found out that day. And so just in that moment of just having, heard the news, and I was quickly reminded, for myself and my family, and really for most of society, that we're really, in some way, just not prepared to deal with loss in a healthy way. And so, it's difficult to navigate those intense feelings at that time. and they kind of overtake you. And so, I just wanted to write this article for those people who, just are experiencing that and are being impacted by that, and just to kind of normalize that, there's no way to prepare for what that can feel like.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And you even mentioned, that grief looks different on everybody, which is super accurate. And I would just love to know, though, as a counselor, is there something universal that you could say about grief or to someone grieving, even though we all experience it differently?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a great question. I know growing up, I kind of thought of grief and walking through grief as a process was kind of fit into these 5 stages of grief, And so, and what we know about grief more now is that it's really a unique experience, and it's unique because the person's unique, and the circumstances and the situations are all unique, and so, you know, those are all the ways that that we look at grief is based off of who we are, and what's happening to us and our experiences, and so that is unique. But there are these like natural responses that we see just trickled in through grief, and one of those that you see is just really common, is the eating and the sleeping patterns change, right? So, and so that looks different too. One person might have have excessive eating and sleeping, while the other person just really doesn't need sleep, or doesn't think they need sleep, and doesn't have a big appetite. And so, and what's crazy about grief is that can change. Like you can be both of those. And so that is one way that is pretty universal. Another way is just our ability to focus and to concentrate. And this can look like you're very forgetful in situations. You can be sitting down and forget what you're thinking about or what you're doing, or you can be driving down the road and you forget, where you're going, and you walk into a room and you're not sure why you went there, why you're in that room, and so so those are universal. And then the biggest one, I think, that even if you know very little about grief or the process of grieving, that you could probably just assume that this was universal, is it's just that like emotional roller coaster that you experience during this time. And so, you experience sadness and helplessness and guilt and shame and anger. And those are just a few of the emotions that kind of, you weave in and out of during this process. And in some way, it can really leave you feeling exhausted, trying to manage all of those feelings. And these are something that's just common, and just to normalize this for people, that this is these are things that are pretty universal. So most people that are walking through grief have experienced one, if not all of these.
Yeah, you mentioned a little bit about like those stages of grief. I mean, are those even real, slash is that like an accurate way to like talk about grief?
Yeah, yeah. I think that when they first came to be, those 5 stages, Dr. Ross was really focusing on clients and their, at the time it was clients who had been diagnosed with I believe, a medical concern that would be pretty big for them, pretty traumatizing for them. And so you really walk through, so that's really where those 5 stages come from. And so, yeah, I think that they've been helpful in just helping us frame this, right? Like we've had a framework for, walking through grief for a while based off of those. But really grief is a process, and that process looks not so much like it fits in those 5 stages, but more or less that the individual is making progress, that they're moving forward in their grief. And so, yeah, that's what we're really wanting to happen in that process. What we're looking for is that we're not just staying stagnant, that that we're experiencing those emotions, that we're noticing, we're noticing the way we're impacted by our grief, and we're able to communicate that with others as well.
Right. Yeah. I think it just going back to that, grief looks a little bit different on everybody, and everyone's different selves, like situations. So let's talk a little bit about the time it takes to grieve. You said it's a process. How do you know when it's time to move forward? How do you know when you spent too much time grieving? Because you want to take that, you want to acknowledge the grief and feel that, but how do you know when it's too much or not enough? What's the balance?
Yeah, yeah, and I think a lot of people look for this, right? It's comforting to know that I only have to do this for this amount of time.
Right.
That'd be so nice.
Right. We want oh, I hit this, mark and this mark and this mark, a finish line.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Like I only have to do this for this amount of time and then I'm good. And so that's reassuring for some people. And a lot of experts will say, between 6 to 12 months is really a good estimated time. But I think I look at it and I look at questions like this and I think, well, let's look at our physical bodies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when we break a bone, when a bone is broken, like we've broken our arm or we've broken our leg, and we go to see an orthopedic doctor, they really, when they're looking at that, they really can give their patient the best estimated guess
Mm-hmm.
on when that bone will be healed and back to full functional use. And
Right.
they do that by by having time to to look at other people in the past and kind of judge like similar situations and give them an estimated time. And also, when you go to see an orthopedic doctor about broken bones, they're going to give you lots of tools to really protect that bone, and to make sure that there's no further damage, right? And so in the same way, if we take that physical part of looking at our bodies and how our bodies heal, and we focus that on our grief and our emotional well-being during that, and we know instead, we look at those steps that we're taking, and we start to recognize that it may look very different for everybody, and yeah, so I think when you're asked, how much time should I look, should I be looking at to fully recover from my grief? I don't really think it's a time, but I think there's certain things to really notice about yourself. And I think, when it's been too long is when you start to see some unhealthy coping mechanisms coming up, right? We start to use those unhealthy coping mechanisms to really, as a way of survival. And so those can be drugs or alcohol, and even things as like working too much or gambling, and even isolation from other people. And so just anything we can use to really numb and distract us from the pain.
Right. Because no one wants to hurt like that.
No, yeah, absolutely not. Nobody wants something broken inside of them, because we feel that, whether it's a bone or whether it's emotional brokenness, we feel that.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, you talk about this, just the importance of the emotional side of things, the importance of feeling those emotions. You actually even say that emotions can help in the healing process. So can you expand on that idea?
Yes. Just during this time, the pain you're experiencing can be so intense, right? And it's so foreign, and it comes on so quickly that you really want to do anything to try to distract yourself from feeling that pain. Like you said, like nobody wants to feel that pain. And so you really try to protect yourself. And I think that's only natural. And so when I see somebody doing this, like like when we see somebody kind of distracting themselves from that pain. I think a lot of just a picture a person keeping their head above water, like treading water, right? Like it looks good, right? It looks really good. It looks like you're doing it. You're staying above water, and that's really good. However, it's not sustainable because you're not going anywhere, and eventually you'll get tired, right? And so what we know about that is like our emotions. They're a psychological state that happens in a part of our brain called the limbic system. And so we really want to pay attention to that. We want to pay attention to those emotions that we're experiencing. And just to know, like, our bodies are made in a way that it can be really helpful in difficult times like this, you know. And I want to go back to like the treading water ideal. And really, if that person treading water would stop and they would let themselves just relax and float, you know, that would be helpful, and they would be able to get somewhere with less effort, and it would be less just less struggle. And so I look at the same way that take for instance just when you're having that emotional piece and you're trying to keep your head above water, that if we can pay attention to what our body is telling us, like it's set up for that, like our brains are telling us, hey, something's not right here, pay attention. And so if we will do that, if we will pay attention, then we can acknowledge those emotions and allow ourselves to experience them fully, it can provide a feeling of completeness and healing.
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to feeling those emotions, and you mentioned this earlier, just that desire that we can often have to isolate ourselves in that space, or, just numbing ourselves, but still isolating. My question for you would just be, how can we practically avoid isolation?
Yeah. And I think if you ask most people, they won't feel like they're isolated. And because there's so many avenues to feel like we are around, like we're with people, we're connecting with people. And so a lot of times people say, I'm not isolated. I work with a large number of people, and then I go home and I'm with my family. And so when we think of isolation, that is really our common way of identifying that is, am I physically distancing myself from people? Am I, and very few people can actually do that, right? Like, it's just not very common for us to be able to sit at home and not be around people for long periods of time. And so there's the other side of it that we really want to look at here, right? Like, not so much the physical distancing, but the social and emotional distancing that really takes place here. And the emotional isolation can put distance in our relationships, right? So if we put distance in our relationships, then it's really going to be difficult to connect with people, and that's what we need a lot when we are struggling and when we're experiencing a lot of pain and struggle, is we need people. And so the ways to kind of identify, just being able to identify that type of isolation, that you can be in a room with full of people, but still be isolating yourself. And that really goes back to, not being vulnerable. And just some ways to kind of fight that piece of isolation is to kind of set a goal, right? Like, set a goal to connect with one person, and one person that you feel safe with and you feel like would understand where you're coming from. And the team at MCO, they're all well trained in AEDP and EFT, that this is something that they can help navigate really well. And so that part of isolation can be really tricky, and finding someone to connect with and be able to be vulnerable with can also be very hard. Another way to kind of, to kind of fight isolation is to use what we have, right? Like a lot of us, the internet and our cell phones kind of get this negative feeling. People talk about them and it really like, oh, and in some ways like, oh, that's really a difficult time in our lives where people are using that to stay isolated. But I say use that and get connected. I know even the staff here at MCO, like we have offices in different areas and we are all staying connected on the Zoom platform. And there's lots of ways that have really been popping up that you can be connected with people and join communities and groups over the internet. So that makes it less intimidating to to have to go to a social setting and be vulnerable. Instead, you can do it in the comfort of your own house at first, and then work your way up to other social interactions. So yeah, use what you have, use the internet, get connected with somebody, in community or, individually. That's all going to help really with that piece of isolation.
Right. Yeah. I feel like I come back to it every single time that I meet with a counselor for one of these episodes. I always come back to avoiding isolation and how important it is to be a part of community as you're grieving, walking through loss, walking through just different struggles, different trials, mental health struggles, family, whatever that may be, just never letting yourself, sit by yourself in that. And just how important that is. And I feel like that is brought up almost every time that I'm talking with a counselor in a video, that's always brought up, and just how important it is. And yet somehow our gut reaction every time that we feel these intense negative emotions is to isolate and not to pull toward people.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and I think that's just a way to protect ourselves,
Yeah.
that we want to protect ourselves. We want to, that part of connecting with somebody else on a deeper level just seems so hard. Because really you're in a vulnerable spot, and connecting with someone would mean that they might see that vulnerability, and that would be hard. And so and it can feel unsafe for lots of reasons for many of us. And so I think it's just, like you said, just noticing that, right? Just noticing that, and then just beginning to have healthy habits, right? And that looks different for everybody. If you are normally this extrovert that talks to a lot of people, that's clearly going to look different for you, fighting isolation in some capacity than somebody who's an introvert just naturally. And so healthy habits, what does that look like? Well, it looks like taking the next step in the right direction. And like you said, the community is great, speaking to a neighbor, just kind of setting those goals. Well, what can I do this week that will help me just to connect with anybody? And then eventually working towards this goal of, I want to connect with somebody, but then on a deeper level, because I can be in community with people and still feel very lonely. And so I want to be able to share my innermost feelings with somebody. And if you don't have that somebody, that's what's great about counseling. And that's what's great about counseling, even, over the internet or, on an online platform, that really, it just kind of helps make that step in that right direction even more achievable.
Yeah, one quote that really stuck out to me in your article was, when the pain is still present, healing is still taking place. I love that quote. And I just think it's so beautiful. And I feel like it's pretty self-explanatory, but at the same time, if you wouldn't mind maybe just expanding a little bit on what that means. And then lastly, just giving a word of encouragement to people who are grieving and struggling through a loss right now.
Absolutely. And I just want to say thank you. That quote means a lot to me personally, and it's, I found it to be true. And I think if we look, just at life in general, not necessarily just at grief, but if we look at life in general, I think about the pain that I felt when I was giving birth to my children.
Mm.
Uh, it was painful. But then, you hold a child, and it's just, that pain just kind of subsides. And then I think about the pain that Jesus experienced on the cross, and like, the pain that he experienced, and then afterwards, what happened, and the feeling you get there. And so it just kind of reminds us that our bodies were made in a way that we can endure pain, whether it's physical or emotional. And so, and I see this a lot. My kids, sometimes they'll run and they'll fall and they'll scratch their knee, and I'll pick them up, and I'll immediately, really want to go in and kind of doctor the scratch that's happened. But what is so neat about that, and what I've just reminded them is, hey, your bodies were meant for this. They were meant for this pain. And almost immediately when that happens, it's like our bodies just kind of recognize that something isn't the way it was meant to be, and they work together, and it starts to work together. And in a few days, what was a little scratch and really painful is now healed. And so I think that is, the same is true when we experience grief. It is kind of signaling our body to respond to the pain we are feeling. And if we can respond to that with our, just recognizing our emotions and letting ourselves experience them without distracting ourselves, then we can find ourselves in a better place.
Mm. Yeah, I think when I read this quote, I was thinking almost of it like a triangle mountaintop, and you think of pain, and sometimes I think I'm at the top, and then pain happens, and I start to kind of decline. But when I read this quote, I was like, no, like actually, your pain is, pushing you forward and allowing you to heal, and get to, the next stage and the next place. And that was kind of what came to mind, I think, when I first read that quote. And I just love it. And I just love your heart and your just great encouragement to people walking through this. I think it's so important that we be talking about it. And hopefully viewers watching this, if you're struggling with something right now, this makes you feel less alone, because you're not alone. And we invite you to find community, whether that be with close family, close friends, or right here at MCO. We want you to have that community and have those people to bring into your grief, and grieve with you.
Yes, absolutely. And I love that you said when the pain happens, you kind of feel like you're declining. And it can feel like that. It can feel like that. And so that just brings up just a great point, that pain kind of just engages or ignites something inside of us to make a change. And,
Mm.
and
Ooh, yes, that's good.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think about people who, like, they have to go to the doctor because they're in some kind of physical pain, and it kind of ignites like something's got to change. And so then they start the healing process there because they're in good hands. And so that just reminds me of, like, stepping into a relationship with a safe person, or even just coming to counseling, can really provide that. Like, something is here and I'm not sure what it is. I know I'm feeling, the pain, and letting somebody else kind of help you navigate that. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's a beautiful picture. So thank you.